Well, a couple of weeks ago, while you were enjoying a beautiful beginning to your week here in Morris, your weekend rather, I was actually out experiencing this. Yeah. It's somewhere along the highway between 610 and 10 in the Blaine area at about 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And most of the cars had one person in them, as people who had more than one person typically took the fast lane, and for those who carpooled anyway. And this continued on for the most part all the way up through St. Cloud. And as I was stuck in traffic, I looked around and began to wonder, where were all these cars going? And where had they all come from? And I wondered, when they reached their destination, was anyone actually waiting there when they arrived? I mean, when we can actually see each other in the cars, we were surrounded by other people, hundreds of us. We were driving along, and yet we were actually all alone. In the words that were made famous by the Beatles, all the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people. Where do they all belong? Well, as I approached St. Cloud, I pulled off to stop at a gas station, and as I was pumping gas, a woman pumping gas on the other side of the pump made a comment about how much she wished she had hair like mine. And she was wearing a scarf, and it appeared that she actually had no hair underneath. And then she began talking about a recent trip to Florida and her family and her health needs. And we were only together for a few minutes, but I have to say, I think there are people all around us who are waiting for somebody to listen to their story, longing to connect with someone. It often happens, and not because I walk around wearing a name tag that says Pastor Lauren or anything, but perhaps because I'm just a regular person that's willing to listen, to allow a connection to happen, to bring a big, fearful world closer to community. Well, this morning, in this series about fear, we turn to the fear of being alone, unloved, and afraid. We all know what it's like to feel alone. I mean, we enter a room filled with people, and what's the first thing that we do? We look around for somebody we know, and if we don't know anyone and no one reaches out to us, it's an awkward feeling. A feeling of being alone, even though we may be surrounded by other people. And on Wednesday, I spent most of my late morning and afternoon visiting church family that are all in care facilities. And each place I visited, several residents, and from each one of them, I heard, "Please come back soon. Come back as often as you can, because the days are so long, and it's very, very lonely here." And I have to tell you, it was in the midst of lunch, and there was picnics going on, and they were sitting with tons of other people, and they were saying this. Loneliness is a feeling of isolation, a feeling that nobody really notices or cares about me. Loneliness is the lack of real companions with whom to share your life. The actress Anne Hathaway says, "Loneliness is my least favorite thing about life. The thing that I'm most worried about is just being alone without anybody to care for or somebody who will care for me." Mother Teresa said, "The most terrible poverty is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved." It was a feeling that she struggled with for much of her life. Loneliness seems so counterintuitive when we are surrounded by people all the time. We live around people, we work around people, attend sporting events, wait in lines, and sit in traffic because there are just so many people. We have hundreds of Facebook friends, and the truth is you can have a lot of friends and be lonely. And in contrast, you can have no friends and not be lonely. Most of us live in homes that were designed to promote privacy, not connection. Some of you remember a time when homes were constructed with front porches, so when people took evening walks or afternoon drives, they would run into neighbors that were out sitting on the porch. And one thing would lead to another, and before long you were actually invited onto that porch for something cool to drink and a conversation. Well, welcome to the 21st century. Who has time to walk through the neighborhood? And what we want is a retreat from the intensity of our lives. We come home, we put the garage door down, and we escape into the television or computer. And if it's outside, it's not to the front porch, but actually to the back deck. We don't want to see more people. We want retreat. We want to get away from them. And the last thing we want at the end of the day is more conversation. I mean, our goal is to avoid people, but it often comes with a cost. The Gallup organization says Americans are the loneliest people in the world. One survey I read said that 90% of the male population in America lack a true friend. We need companionship. From the beginning of time, we were created to be relational. In the Genesis story of creation, God creates the world and everything in it, and at the end of each day, God looks at what God has created and said, "It is very good." But in the second chapter of Genesis, for the first time, God says, something is not good. God looks at the man and the human that God has created and said, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. And when the man falls asleep, God removes one of his ribs and forms a new and improved version of the man, human 2.0. You know, we hear this story so often in marriages. But I believe that this part of the story is not only about marriage, but about our need for companionship. You know, I started to write this message while I was at my son's babysitting, and as I sat down to write this message at his kitchen table, my granddaughter came and begged me to pick her up. She wanted to be held. She had the whole house filled with toys and her brother to play with, but she wanted to be in Grandma's arms. Or how many of you have pets that like to be right underfoot at all times? You know, folks, we were created to do life together. The first 9 months of life are spent inside another human, and somewhere between 23 and 27 weeks, we hear our mother's heartbeat for the first time. We hear her breathing and the sound of her voice, and no wonder when we're first born we cry in the middle of the night, not just because we're hungry for food, but to be held. And at the end of life, that's also what we crave. I received a message that my good friend Christine in high school is dying, and she's in hospice. And I haven't seen Christine in years, but she specifically asked for me to come because I was so far away, and she is in Eden Prairie, and she wanted me to come immediately. I asked another pastor friend of mine, Judy, to stop by, and she went over to be with her. And Judy told me she took her hand and she stroked her face, and not even knowing if Christine was aware or not, but she could see it in her eyes that this was an answer to prayer, that she had come. You know, there'll be many times of loneliness when we feel hurt or betrayed or unloved and all alone. But sometimes that sense of loneliness lasts so long and is so deep that we are convinced that we will never be loved. No one wants us to be around. Maybe it was something in our childhood, neglected or rejected, abandoned. And we've carried that with us the rest of our lives. And so we withdraw, because that's the way we won't feel rejected. You know, as I mentioned over the past couple of weeks, fear can cause us to react with fight, flight, or freeze. So we remove ourselves from opportunities to connect with others and create this shell around us so that we can't be hurt. When somebody we need is desperate for companionship, we don't know how to let somebody else in. Some of you are contemplating retirement or have entered retirement and having determined you could retire once your finances were in order. But what you don't realize is that when you exit the workplace, you also walk away from people from whom you spend 40 to 50 hours a week. The greatest indicator of happiness in retirement is not how much you have in your 401k, but how many meaningful relationships you have. We need companions. You know, last week I was listening to a podcast by a woman by the name of Danielle Strickland. And she's the author and speaker from Toronto who has devoted her life to putting an end to human trafficking. And in her talk, she described a recent flight where she found herself in a seat on the plane next to another gentleman. And like many of us, she took out her headphones and a book and hoping that she would have a couple hours of solitude. And then this gentleman, in what looked to her to be like a $10,000 suit, was sitting right next to her. And as the plane pulled away from the gate, he asked, "Well, what do you do?" And not wanting conversation, she decided to respond with the words she usually used to stop a conversation. And she said, "I travel around the world telling people about Jesus." And undeterred, he replied, "Well, does that make you an evangelist?" "You could say that," she said. And he responded, "Well, that's interesting, because on my last flight, I was sitting next to an evangelist." And putting her book down, she said, "And how long have you been running from God?" And he said, "Well, I really don't know about God." So for the rest of the flight, she listened to his story, the crisis that he was in. He had lost job after job, and he put his company at risk, and he lost his relationship, and he was feeling alone and unloved. And his whole life was falling down around him. And she told him about God's presence and love and how he had already been forgiven, and explained to him that that's why Jesus died on the cross. And she said if Jesus could accept God's forgiveness, then he could most definitely find a way to forgive himself. And when the flight ended and they were standing at the baggage carousel, he said, "You saved my life." And she replied that really it's God who does that. But he said, "Really, you saved my life. You see, I had a plan to end my life tonight. But you have shown me that there is hope and that there is another way." In the Gospel of Mark, we find a story where 4 people come alongside a person in need and brought that person to Jesus to be healed. Mark tells us the man is paralyzed, but we are not told whether it is physical, emotional, or spiritual paralysis. All we know is that he needs others alongside him. So these 4 people, friends maybe, perhaps it was Brent, or perhaps strangers, we are not told. All we know is that they came alongside and put him on a stretcher. And they became his stretcher bearers. They carried him into the house, but when they arrived, they couldn't get close to Jesus. But they are determined, and they will not be deterred. And they climbed the stairs to the roof, and once they were on the flat roof, they dug a way through it. And when the hole in the roof was large enough, they lowered their friend to meet Jesus at his feet. And Jesus looks up at those 4 stretcher bearers, recognizing their love for the man that they're now face to face with. And he sees the compassion and their faith in what Jesus could do. And Jesus heals the man. It's by the faith of 4 friends that the paralytic is able to walk again. He got up, he took his mat out, and he walked out in full view of all of them. And this amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." The answer to loneliness that we experience is having stretcher bearers, companions who will come alongside us. And that's why the church exists. The church is a community of people who are trying to love each other. Jesus said, "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so must you love one another." The church I experienced as a new Christian was a place where I knew I was accepted and loved. Even when life was not going well for me, when I felt rejected everywhere else, I would come to church, knowing that I would be accepted and loved. It is possible to feel that here when we gather for worship, but you can also attend worship for years and years and have no meaningful relationships. That's why our fellowship time and Bible studies and women's fellowship lunches and quilters and mission knitters and children's church and countless other group activities are so important. That's where we do life together. That's where we find our stretcher bearers. No one here, there is no one here, who doesn't need what one of these types of groups can offer. You know, I'm also aware that when you show up here on Sundays, that there are people here who wonder if anyone cares, if anyone here will reach out to them. No one here knows everybody. I try, and, you know, there are others who try, but I don't even know everybody by their name. Haven't you sat down next to somebody, maybe you greeted them during the service, but you don't really know who they are? I mean, what would it take to greet the people around you or to offer a time that you could sit and share each other's story? Especially those of you who might have judged another person on their appearance or felt judged, or because they don't believe in the same things you do, you don't talk to each other. You know, I'd like everyone who walks out of here to know that they are loved and valued. But I can't do this alone. I need your help. You know, there's another answer to our loneliness as well, and that is God. God created us to be in relationship with God. The writer of Psalm 139 begins, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" You know, we are never really alone. God is saying, I made you. I know you. There is not a moment that I am not with you. I am with you even when you try to push me away. I know every thought. I know the worst thing that you have ever done, and I still love you. Loneliness is something we all face. There are answers to the loneliness. We need companionship, and God is as near as the air you breathe. Let us pray. God of grace, you made us with a capacity to love and to be loved. You call us son and daughter and friend. You love us with a love unlike any that we have ever known. Love that's completely unconditional. May we always love you in return. Give us hearts ready to experience the full measure of your love so that we will be your presence of love to those around us each day. Amen.